You're listening to the SSPX podcast, and welcome to this episode of the Crisis in the Church series. A slightly different episode for you this week, as we're not tackling a new topic, but we're getting some questions answered that some of our listeners and viewers asked about the recent set of episodes on the Novus Ordo Mass. Father Franks joined us to go a little deeper on questions like the validity of the new Mass, why this rite is different from the other rites the Church has had in its history, and bluntly, how does the Society of St. Pius X have any authority or standing to even discuss these matters? If you'd like to learn more about this series we're doing on the Crisis in the Church, or if you'd like to go back and revisit our previous 24+ episodes, or if you want to support this project, please visit sspxpodcast.com/crisis. Now, let's turn to our questions and answers with Father Franks. Welcome to the SSPX podcast. We're doing an extra episode this week with Father Franks. Hi, Father. How are you?
Hi, Andrew. Very busy. Very busy.
Well, thank you for taking the time to go through these with us. Our listeners had some questions, and there were some comments on YouTube, and so we're going to be picking and choosing some comments from YouTube and just asking them to you, Father, and we'll see what happens on this episode. This is kind of a fly by the seat of your pants one, but I think it'll be good. First question, probably.
Yeah.
First question from Richard. Father, how can you say that the Roman canon of the new Roman Missal isn't valid?
Yeah. So I presume that he's using the word valid in the strict sense of sacramentally valid, as in actually having the ability to confect the sacrament, rather than valid as in sort of theologically valid or in some broader sense. There's an interesting article on this question of the Roman canon, because you know what happened in the new Missal is that there's a choice of 4 Eucharistic prayers, 1, 2, 3, and 4, in the place of the Roman canon from the traditional Mass, and by there's an actual. We can object that there's not a complete identity between Eucharistic prayer number 1 and the Roman canon. In fact, some of the things. Well, first of all, it's lost its obligatory and binding character as canon, as fixed. The Roman canon is called the canon because it's a fixed rule that never changes, and the Eucharistic prayer number 1 is one of 4, and many of the Roman saints have become optional, and the signs of the cross can be optional now. So it's not exactly the same as the Roman canon to start off with, and of course the words of consecration have been changed. Again, it's another lack of identity with the traditional Roman canon. But that's kind of quibbling. Sure. It doesn't really matter. But no, we're not. The SSPX hasn't attacked the new rite of Mass classically by arguing against its validity. Condemned. So the deficiencies in the rite are our point of criticism, not the validity of the sacrament. We're happy to grant that the Eucharistic prayer number 1, when said with the right intention by a validly ordained priest with the right matter, can be valid and can confect the sacrament. We're happy to concede that. Okay, so the issue is not so much that whether or not it's valid or invalid. The SSPX is not saying that it's not valid. It's saying that there are deficiencies, there are problems with it. That's not our point of criticism, no. Right. It's possible that there could be one or the other Mass that may be invalid, but that's not our point of criticism. Okay. We would be happy to concede the validity of all the Novus Ordo Masses, and we would still argue against them as theologically deficient expressions of the Catholic doctrine and still as dangerous. Got it. Yeah. All right. That's a good distinction. Thank you. On the same sort of topic, Michael said there are different rites in the Catholic Church. Eastern churches have different Eucharistic prayers. And he said the Novus Ordo liturgy is closer to the primitive Christian liturgy. So I guess kind of 2 points there. There are different liturgies. There are different Eucharistic prayers. Yes.
Is that an issue?
Is that an issue? No, it's not an issue. I mean, there have been different rites since forever. I hate to say it, our Lord Jesus Christ on the day of the Last Supper didn't put on Roman vestments and make the sign of the cross and make up a brown vow and say, Introit altare Dei in Latin.
Right.
The different rites have been the different human clothings of those divine elements by different cultures, all Christian, around the divine elements, because different people have different natural characteristics, geniuses, languages, artistic expressions, temperaments, national temperaments, and so on. And that's something that the Church has always celebrated and welcomed. Maybe there have been tensions at times between East and West, but the Church herself, as a good mother, has always celebrated and rejoiced in the diversity of Catholic rites of her children. So that's not in itself a problem for us. And I suppose the implicit objection is, if there are so many diversities of rites, the new rite is just another one. So what's the problem? Especially if it seems to get back to the more primitive models. So if it's, in other words, and this is very much where you sit on this sort of position is going to be a sort of dividing line in 20th century Catholic theology, because the whole of the new theology framed itself and presented itself as a resourcement back to the sources. So we are the traditionalists, we are the ones going back to the fathers, and you, who call yourselves traditionalists, are just ultramontanists who got stuck in the late 19th century and didn't know what to do when things moved on.
Right.
So we're more traditional than you are, actually, because we're the ones resourcing everything to the fathers and to St. Thomas and to the Bible, and you're the ones who are repeating the same 19th century commentators and popes over and over again in a closed hermetic system.
Right.
That's kind of their line. And that, if you read Humani Generis, that appealed to the sources in order to shuffle off the precisions added by the 19th century, the 20th century magisterium, early 20th century, the 18th century, the Thomistic commentators, the Church's further precisions. And that sort of movement the Church doesn't like in doctrine, and Pius XII was clear as well, doesn't really like in liturgy. If you read Mediator Dei, he condemns in the liturgy something that he calls archaeologism. Now, archaeologism means going back to the very, very earliest, most primitive expressions of liturgical expressions and taking them as a template and a standard for reforming the present-day Catholic liturgy, and he doesn't like it. You can go away and read Mediator Dei on that, but for the same reasons that just as a traditionalist author would say, the profound reason of seeking a greater contact with the fathers, and some of them, it wasn't even the church fathers, it was, Origen, and authors that were ecclesiastical authors, not even saints and not even Orthodox. It's to shuffle off the precision of the later theology, the more precise Catholic theology, and the sort of archaeologist tendency in the liturgy also showed its head. And I had this argument with a Novus Ordo liturgist, a friend of mine. I won't name his name, but and it's good for us to engage across these theological battle lines, because sometimes you think you're very confident in your point, and he said, I'm a Catholic and I'm a traditional Catholic, and I think it's terrible what was done to the churches, because in all of the churches, they removed the tabernacles from the central place in the churches, and they put the tabernacles in the corner to get rid of Christ, to de-emphasize the real presence of the Eucharist, to please the Protestants, and it's terrible, and they've taken my Lord, and I don't know what they've done with him. And he said, You don't know anything about liturgical history. They're just restoring your parish church to the model of a medieval cathedral, where the bishop's chair would always have pride of place and the Blessed Sacrament would always be in a side chapel. And nobody accused the medievals of having a lack of devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, but the presiding chair is the important thing. So it's true to say that they do have a set of justifications for those changes that they've made. And they're not always like, let's find a way to minimize the Blessed Sacrament. Ha ha ha.
Right.
Concretely, that's what's happened. And we know that there are some modernists who are very pleased with those changes for those reasons. And we know that it's damaged the faith of the people. So I think we can separate. We don't have to judge the intention of the reforms. We can listen to the justification, but we can still say it hasn't been a good thing for the church. It has diminished the Eucharistic devotion of the people and the sense of the real presence. And thank you very much for your experiment to restore my parish church to a medieval cathedral, but I want it back, and I want Christ in the Blessed Sacrament back in the center. And if that means that I'm incurably 19th century and Vatican I, then I'll own the label.
Right. Right. And it sounds kind of funny for a traditionalist to say this, but not everything that is old is good. And that's not what tradition is about anyway. We're not, like you said, just liturgical archaeologists.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yeah.
It's very interesting.
I don't know if I answered that objection, really. I mean, the thing is, what Pius XII says is, for ressourcement, they hope that once we've got back to a simpler form of expression from Scripture, from the Fathers, that Catholic doctrine can be favorably compared with the doctrine of the non-Catholics, and we can have a greater unity. So he's saying, behind the ressourcement movement, there's also the ecumenical intention. And behind the liturgical ressourcement, if you like, the primitivist, the archaeologist tendency, also the ecumenical intention was overt and explicit for the reformers. And here's the thing. There are two big principles that the liturgical reformers used. So the one was restoration of primitive Christian practice, getting back to the pristine tradition before all of the overlays of the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So antiquity, restoration of antiquity. And the other one was pastoral adaptation to the modern world, active involvement and engagement with the pastoral needs of the day. And between those two things, you can justify pretty much whatever you want.
Right.
So either you say it was the early practice of the church, or you say this is what the pastoral needs of modern man require. And the fact is, we know what their intentions were at a doctrinal level because they were explicit. You know, we have those quotes that I presented to you, Archbishop Bonini, to remove everything that could provide so much of a shadow of a stumbling block or some displeasure to the separated brethren. The quote of Monsignor Lengling about, the interfaith dimensions and the prominence given to the theology of Dom Odo Cassel, and the Paschal Mystery theology, which traditionists object to, and seems to be very much at odds with the theology of the Council of Trent and the traditional conception of the redemption, which they overtly said, this is the theology we're using for the liturgical reform. We have their quotes. So it's not as if the traditionists are just seeing something and reading it in the worst possible light. If we're doing that, it's because we have the avowal of the creators where they made their intentions explicit and clear, and we know that those intentions are not favored by the church. We've seen the condemnation of ecumenism. We've seen the condemnation of the reconception of the redemption. We're not making these things up.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Moving on to here are some comments from the number 25, should Catholics attend the Novus Ordo Mass? There's one here I think that is probably fairly easy to answer, or at least a short answer. Crossing the Trail said, what if a Byzantine Catholic or a Melkite rite Mass is available as an alternative to the Novus Ordo Mass? Can I go?
Yeah. I don't know that it's that much of a straightforward answer, actually. A bit like Father Robinson's thing. Father Robinson's categorization was into sort of three broad categories. There are masses which pose no danger whatsoever to the faith because they're offered by a traditionalist priest who is truly such. That is, he sees the danger of the new principles. He opposes them as a matter of the faith, not just as a matter of preference. And he offers a traditional rite. Then there are masses where the rite is traditional, but it could be there could be some inconveniences or some dangers in the milieu, in the theology of the priest offering, and the things surrounding, where we can say there's some danger to the faith, but the rite is still a Catholic rite. So that's a bit more foggy, and that's where the whole question of prudence and what exactly is going on there, and case by case, and whereas the person who's even going at, and that whole thing enters in, which is why Father Robinson was unwilling to just be like,
right,
bam, 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 yes, you know. And then the things that are clearly dangerous in themselves,
right,
which is going to be, modernist rites and so on, the new ones. So the non-Western rites, the Church loves and has no problem with. But you have to know that after Vatican II, the liturgical reforming that brought us the new rite of Mass in the Western world did not limit itself to the Western world, and that the traditional rites of the East were also affected to different degrees in different rites. So sometimes when you say it's a Byzantine rite, they wouldn't say Mass because that's a Western term. They would say liturgy, Eucharistic liturgy. Yeah. Divine liturgy or Melkite rite liturgy. Sometimes that might mean really the ancient, unchanged, traditional Melkite rite, the ancient, unchanged Byzantine rite, in which case the rite itself poses no problem.
Right.
Or it might mean something that has suffered the same sort of liturgical vandalism and maybe been altered even as a vehicle of the new theology, I think, as the new Mass. And I haven't looked in great detail myself into all of the adaptations of those different non-Western liturgies, but they're not, when they say Maronite, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the traditional rite as it was prior to the council and from antiquity. So there's a question mark there over what form of the rite itself and what kind of changes have been introduced. Then, and this gets a little bit ahead of where we were, and we had some viewers who were upset by some of Father Robinson's comments, particularly about the Fraternity of St. Peter. And I understand that because we haven't talked about that yet. It came a little bit out of place. So we will talk a little bit about the differences of position on the crisis between the Fraternity of St. Peter and the Society of St. Pius X, and hopefully give some context for why the Society would take the sorts of positions that Father Robinson articulated, to explain ourselves a little bit before just firing condemnations. And
it's not that you and Father Robinson are just sitting here trying to be tribalistic about it and say, well, I am an SSPX priest, therefore I want you to go to an SSPX Mass. I mean, of course you think the SSPX is the right place to go. Otherwise you wouldn't be an SSPX priest. So of course, yes, you're going to say that. But at the same time,
that's the thing. If we thought that there was no problem caused by the positions of some of the other Latin Mass groups, we would actually have no right to be doing what we're doing.
Right.
Because we're not in a regular canonical position.
Right.
So unless there's a necessity that justifies that, which means that the state of necessity isn't ended even by the existence of these groups, which we don't think it is, I wouldn't have the right to be sitting here as an SSPX priest, St. Mary's wouldn't be have the right to have our school and to have our parish and so on. We should shut down, and everybody can go to Maple Hill if they want, So, yeah, there's a difference of perspective and judgment there, difference of position there. So no, it's not just a question of tribalism. I mean, everywhere you get humans, you get tribalism, eh? Right. We don't get away from that. Right. And with the fraternity and the society, I mean, we split from the same people, the same organization. So certainly, even maybe some amongst the older priests, there might be some animus. You don't find it so much amongst the younger priests. I found them all very, very cordial and polite, and we try our best to be the same to them. It's history, and So, right. But no, I mean, sorry, I'm just lots of tangents. But even if you have a traditional Eastern rite, the question is what surrounds it, because for the SSPX. The rite itself is not just the crisis of the church isn't just the crisis of the liturgy.
Exactly.
There's also the crisis of the theology that surrounds it. The tendency in the church to naturalism, to ecumenism, to a new theology which is hostile to the faith and undermines the faith, which is more or less officialized in something like the New Catechism. So. If it's just a traditional rite, but all of the ecumenism is there surrounding it, and all of the other things are there surrounding it, so that it's essentially like a Novus Ordo environment. Can I say that?
Right.
But it's a traditional Byzantine rite or something. But they're so Byzantine that everything's to emphasize and the union with the Orthodox, and there's the kind of world that could lead a Catholic to get disorientated and say, "Why am I even Catholic? What's the problem? What's the point?" Then we would say it becomes a danger not in itself, but in its taken as a whole. The priest may still not have a traditional theological formation. So there still could be things in the sermons. The priest may not see all the problems, and certainly to the extent that it's ecumenical, and the extent that it becomes a naturalistic or a non-Catholic environment, that would be an excusing cause from mass attendance. As I understand it, in the old days, actually being constrained to attend outside of your rite was already an excusing cause. It was just, it's too different, and it's too much to expect these poor Western Catholics to go to something that's so culturally foreign anyway, that it would have considered that you don't have to go. So, don't think traditionally the mind of the church is that we go church hopping between different rites, actually.
I think the tradition is what the rite that you're baptized in is what you should stay in, generally speaking.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's for sure. Yeah. But even as far as like worship, that you shouldn't be hopping around. That's the kind of mind of the church classically. Yeah. So may you go? I can't tell you if it's a traditional rite that nobody's fooled around with to bring the new theology with it. I don't think I'm in a position to tell you may not go, that it would be sin to go or something. But then look at the environment. Right. In all of its totality, is it a traditionalist environment? And if you have kids, all of that sort of thing. Yeah. What sort of associations and so on. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to, but if you're trying to raise a family or something, and it's not determinant, the main things are the theological things, but then again, like
all these things, it becomes a matter of prudence. Yeah.
The main thing there, the main danger for us as traditional Catholics is that we'll obscure in our own minds the essentially doctrinal theological nature of the crisis, and we'll come to think it's just a crisis of the liturgy, which can just be solved by a traditionalist liturgy. It's like there's much more going on in the church. There are many more dangers than just this mass or that mass.
Right.
So is the environment protected from those dangers, or does it expose you to those dangers?
I think that's hugely important to bring up, Father, and I know we're probably going to talk about it at another episode, probably when we talk about the Society of St. Pius X itself and the state of necessity and all that stuff that we'll get to later on towards the end of the series. But I think I saw in another comment on a previous video, someone saying, well, why is the SSPX even still in existence? After the motu proprio in 2007, you guys don't even have a state of necessity anymore. And the issue is, it's not about the liturgy. Just because the liturgy was made more widely available and Pope Benedict gave that motu proprio, the issue has never been about the traditional Latin Mass. It's been about the traditional Latin Mass and everything else that surrounds it, and the modernism and all that. Yeah.
And precisely, we fight for the traditional Mass because we fight for the traditional theology.
Right.
And they fight against the traditional Mass because they fight against the traditional theology. So it's the most obvious point of issue, but it's certainly not. It's not even the most important one. If we oppose the new Mass, it's because we oppose ecumenism. So if you take away the new Mass and leave us with ecumenism, we still have the problem.
Right. So. We did have a few comments on that same video that were all probably around the same sort of, getting at the same sort of point. One person said, obedience before preference. So you guys just prefer the Latin Mass, you should obey. Another person said, the SSPX, by virtue of its position, is taking a classical Protestant stance by protesting the post-conciliar church. Another person said, SSPX is overstepping, telling people to stay at home if they can't get to a traditional Latin Mass is an overstep of authority. They have no authority to dispense with the Sunday obligation. So those are all kind of in the same thing. What gives you, Father, a priest of the SSPX, the right to tell people what to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the judgment of the traditional priests following Archbishop Lefebvre that the new rite of the Mass, we can show that it contains principles condemned by the Church and as such constitutes a danger to the Church, a danger to the faith of the faithful, that it introduces ecumenism, that it leans in the direction of Protestantism and deliberately Protestantism, that it embodies a new theology that the Church is at odds with. We don't want our faith to be distorted, and we realize these were the intentions of the people who made it. They were explicit. It's been accepted by the Protestants and so on, and celebrated. And Dr. Max Furian saying that it could be accepted and celebrated by a Protestant and a Catholic alike. So, and it's had a bad effect on the faith of the people. So we've got enough evidence there to see there's a problem here. We have the Ottaviani intervention, a striking departure from the theology of the Catholic theology of the Mass formulated at the Council of Trent. We have enough people in positions of theological competence, and on both the liberal and the conservative side, admitting that there's ecumenism involved here and that there's a new theology involved here, enough for us to say, okay, this is something to be considered carefully. I think the whole question of dispensation and the Sunday obligation is more what Father Robinson was talking about. So for us, Archbishop Lefebvre always insisted, just coming back onto St. Thomas and the basics, a law is an ordinance of reason for the common good, promulgated by one having the care of the community. So, an ordinance of reason, it has to be reasonable, ordering people to their end, for the common good, legitimately promulgated by the true authority. Okay. And we would object that the new Mass doesn't fulfill the notion of law on a couple of cases. I mean, it's not reasonable to ask us to assist at a rite that we know introduces principles and is founded for the sake of leading towards principles that the church has already condemned, that's not a reasonable request. And it's not for the common good, for the common good of the church is the faith and the living of the faith and the sanctity of souls, salvation of souls. And we can see that this Mass leads away from that just by looking at what the people who made it said, looking at what the competent theological authorities judging it said, looking at the effect that it's had on people statistically and maybe anecdotally. We've got enough evidence that we can be sure beyond a prudent doubt. In other words, morally certain, which is the only sort of certainty the church requires of us and the only sort of certainty you can have in practical matters, that this is not for the good of the church. And therefore, if it's not for the good of the church, it is not a law. It's an unjust law is no law. An unjust law is no law. So the law that tells me, jump off this cliff and fall to your death, or does something, you may have one child and no more, so you have to use immoral means after you have your one child. It's not a just law and doesn't bind me. So what the SSPX is not saying is, you have your Sunday obligation and I dispense you because I am the bishop, or what we're saying is, this sort of Mass isn't the sort of thing that falls under an obligation to go to. It's not like the law would not apply there. Just like and even if it's valid, just imagine you found an old priest in Elizabethan England, ordained a Catholic priest who'd now gone along with the changes and accepted the prayer book of Edward VI or the reforms of Cranmer or something. So the rite is of Protestant and Calvinist inspiration, and he says it in English and all of the things, but he's still a validly ordained priest, and he still says, "For this is my body." He says that the consecration such as to be valid. Mm-hmm. We're not going to say to any Catholic, you're obliged to go to that under pain of losing your soul. Now, it's slightly different because there's a clear, and there was an excommunication and so on, and Henry's schism and so on. Right. But in itself, we have a rite, validly ordained priest, a rite that doesn't express the Catholic theology, but yet valid in that case. And the Catholic would say, no, I have no obligation to go, and I should not go. And the church has canonized people for refusing to go to those sorts of things. The recusants, who paid the fine rather than go to the Anglican services, they're the heroes of Catholic history. And so it's not a question of our dispensing, it's a question of using our moral certainty that this rite has not been for the good of the church, that it does endanger the faith, to say, in which case the church cannot oblige me to something that's evil or dangerous. And that's how we understand the new rite, that you'll find traditionalists saying evil, but in the metaphysical sense, lack of a do-good, lack of a due-good, that there's something that should be there which is not there. I mean, I would say the point of the Sunday obligation is to worship God in the way that he wants. So if we know that he wants a rite which we know he wants to be worshipped by the sacrifice of Christ, which makes up for the sins of the world offered by the priest, then we don't want to offer him a rite that has deliberately concealed those Catholic elements for the sake of pleasing Protestants and ecumenism, endangers the faith of the faithful, that introduces an ambiguity into the most fundamental act of a human towards God, which is the act of sacrifice, that leads to a loss of reverence for God, that makes man forget his true position before God as a sinner in need of mercy, that diminishes the prayers for the dead, changes the Confiteor, lets us forget purgatory and the pains of hell. That's a voluntary occasion of exposing ourselves to a diminution of the faith. None of those things, once we see that way, if that's our judgment, that we say, that how can God be pleased with this? Even if valid, even if from that one point of validity you would say the angels are on their faces, but still the rite is taken as a whole. and the act is taken as a whole with all of its circumstances. In a sense, if an apostate Catholic priest passed a bakery and had a glass of wine in his hand and said, Hoc est enim corpus meum with the bakery, and consecrated the wine, then you have a valid mass, and it's infinitely pleasing to Almighty God from that one point of validity. Does that make the whole act a good act? A Catholic would still be horrified. Now, that's a very strong comparison for the new Mass, and I don't mean to say that there's any malice on the part of the priests who celebrate it, and so on. These are often, good pious men doing their best, but they do not see clearly with the same, at least with that judgment. I would argue that we have in the traditionalist movement, through the providential benefits of a very clear-sighted soul like Archbishop Lefebvre, a man of the church, who Archbishop Schneider says reading his writings is like reading one of the great fathers of the church. He said that in his most recent book.
Right.
So how can we be so sure? I would argue we have enough certitude combined with all of those things. They told us why they were doing it. The conservative theologians agree. We've seen the fruits of it. It all points in a bad direction. And that's enough. At the end of the day, you know that the internet is a big place and the church is a big place, and you can go and find people who will tell you what you want them to tell you. But this is the judgment of tradition.
Yeah. This is
of the traditionalist movement on the SSPX. Now, you can find an article online that we have on our SSPX site. The Archbishop Lefebvre, it is tradition that condemns the new rite of Mass. It is not I. Where he shows these, the errors that we know to be in the new rite already tradition has spoken about. The Council of Trent has spoken about, and so on. And I think that's interesting. An interesting thing for the, do the SSPX's masses fulfill your Sunday obligation, which came up in one of these thunder thumbs, repeatedly stated those who wish to attend the SSPX Mass because there's no other option, that by attending such a Mass they do not satisfy their Sunday obligation, obedience before preference. Father Weizmann, I think, or somebody's going to talk about the limits and nature of obedience a little bit later, so hold that thought. Yeah. But Father Z is of a different opinion, which you must know. He's been writing about this more and more recently as a canonist, Father Zulsdorf. He's probably a known author. And his position is pretty much, he makes reference to the times when he was working for the Ecclesia Dei Commission and how they handled things. And what he says is, as I've written a zillion times on this blog about fulfilling Sunday and holy obligations, in Canon 1248, number 1, we read that a person who assists at a Mass celebrated anywhere in a Catholic rite, either on the feast day itself or on the evening of the day, satisfies the obligation of participating in Mass. Again, the SSPX priest uses a Latin rite and the Missale Romanum and other liturgical books of the Latin Church. So yes, you can choose to go to a Mass of the SSPX, not just because there's no other Mass, but because you want to. No question. So that's his position. And he goes on to talk about all of those sorts of things that raised issues there. But he's always treating how did we deal with it when I was sitting there and people appealed to us for these sorts of questions on the commission that was established for determining the Latin Mass relations in the Catholic world. So, and he's an interesting and learned character. So that would be a sort of counterpoint there. Obedience before preference. For us, it's not a preference.
It's not preference, right?
It's not a preference. For us, our attachment to the new Mass, to the traditional Mass, is firmly doctrinal. Our opposition to the new Mass is firmly doctrinal, and it's what we believe ourselves held to do in conscience, as wanting to keep the faith and be loyal sons of the Church. I have no, woe to me if I did not fight the new Mass.
Right.
So obedience before preference, if you mean preference for the traditional Mass over the Old Mass, that's not our position. It's not a preference of we like Latin and lace and smells and bells, and we prefer extraordinary things to ordinary things.
Right.
That's not our position. We guard the traditional Mass because we're Western Catholics who want to keep the liturgical expression of the faith of always. And then obedience before preference, what SSPX versus the other traditionalist groups, that will come later, that sort of discussion. But obviously those who feel in conscience unable to assist at a Mass of the Fraternity of St. Peter or something have their reasons, because they view that there's some danger to principles there. We'll discuss that later. That's not for me to talk about now.
Okay. I really wanted to catch you on some sort of a zinger, like a one-line thing that I can blast all over the internet. But
oh, really? Yeah. I don't want to be blasted all over the internet.
Oh, that's boring.
unless people, never mind. All right, better go.
All right. Thank you, Father. Thank you for listening to and watching this episode of our Crisis in the Church series here on the SSPX podcast. In episode 27, Father Patrick Summers will join us to speak about ecumenism. We'll explore the effects of ecumenism on the Catholic Church and how, instead of being the new way to evangelize, as was blindly promised so many years ago, threatens to turn Catholicism into a schizophrenic religion. If you have a question on the topic of the crisis, please feel free to ask it at sspxpodcast.com/crisis. Please share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. And if they don't know what a podcast is, please show them so that they can take advantage of all our episodes. And if you have the ability to set up a monthly recurring donation of $5 or $10 or $20 on sspxpodcast.com, it would help us immensely to complete this Crisis in the Church project. Until next week, thank you for listening, and God bless you.